Okay, so our last talk is going to be given by Professor Gerald Schlabach, sitting to my extreme left, and it's called A Pilgrim People, No Peace Theology Without Peace Ecclesiology. And it's going to be responded to by Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Cutright. Just say a few remarks about Kevin, great colleague of mine at West Point, assistant professor of philosophy, and he's currently finishing up his PhD at St. Louis University, and soon to be defending his dissertation, Empathetic Soldier, right? Yes. Yeah, Empathetic Soldier is his dissertation. So, thanks to Kevin. And as for our guest of honor here, so Gerald is a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He holds a PhD in theology and ethics from the University of Notre Dame and an MA in theological studies from the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary. During much of the 1980s, Professor Schlabach worked with the Mennonite Central Committee in Nicaragua and Honduras on church-related peace and justice assignments. Professor Schlabach's interests range widely in issues of peacemaking, social justice, globalization, and the integrity of traditional communities. His critical appropriation of Augustinian thought is reflected in his book, For the Joy Set Before Us, Augustine and Self-Denying Love. And he has numerous other works in this regard as well. He has a book that is due out later this year called A Pilgrim People, Becoming a Catholic Peace Church, will be published later this year by Liturgical Press. Please join me in welcoming Gerald.
I've timed out my presentation pretty carefully and closely so I could fulfill the assignment, but I have to violate that out front by adding another minute just to say how pleased I am to be at Villanova. In 1991 or 2, I was early in my time at Notre Dame. I went kicking and screaming into a class on Augustine, and then found I had a real affinity. My professor, John Cavadini, a few of you may know, suggested that I submit the paper to your PMR conference, Patristic Medieval Renaissance, and it was accepted, and then I did the paper. Father Alan Fitzgerald sat in on that, encouraged me to submit it. So it was my first formal academic presentation and then my first formal journal article to be published back at the other end of my career. And I'm starting to think about retirement, so it feels like it is a bit of a bookend, although I'm not dead yet, but anyway. So, thank you. Matters of war and peace always take human beings back to basics, or should. What are our deepest values? What, if anything, is worth fighting, killing, or dying for? What, if anything, must we protect at all costs? But what if those costs include the moral injury that comes when we override our ordinary ethics, everyday norms, and usual claims of conscience? How to protect not only our lives, but our integrity. But then who are we, really? This, I believe, is why action for peace needs more than simply savvy political tactics and knockdown arguments for or against war. The latest war. Deep questions of identity are always at play, sometimes hidden, yet always decisive. And this, for Christians, is why peace activism, even when armed with what has been called the force more powerful of Gandhian nonviolence rather than lethal armaments, needs peace theology. Indeed, this is why peace theology needs peace ecclesiology. Ecclesiology refers to the study of the church and its role in God's saving work, its purpose, vocation, and posture in the world. At a time when identity politics is contentious from all sides, we must nonetheless take the risk of recognizing that ecclesiology is all about identity. Fortunately, and thanks to an elegant paradox, we need not shy away from this recognition. The elegant paradox is this: already at the launch of salvation history, God gave to Abraham and Sarah an endlessly creative, outward-facing identity. It is one that they and their children could only protect by putting it at risk. They were being blessed in order to become a blessing to all families of the earth. But what a strange identity ensues. Whenever God's people seek to protect their identity and keep it to themselves through a defensive, fearful siege mentality, they have already lost it. Jesus Christ, the Lord whose throne is a cross, confirms and seals this paradox, the paradox of this identity forever. In his kingdom, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for his sake will find it. Now, that conviction could be the starting point to argue for a thoroughgoing Christian pacifism that refuses to participate in violence of any kind. But my task today is not to resolve the long-standing debate between pacifist and just war Christians. If we're to find any leverage for prying our way out of that impasse, we need to start elsewhere. We may locate that starting point by triangulating from a couple of different angles. One angle, all who affirm the early Christian confession of faith that Jesus is Lord must expect that the claims of peer group, tribe, nation state, or empire will sometimes run counter to their primary loyalty to Jesus as they join with others who follow him in the pilgrim people we call church. A second angle, those of us who have Catholic in our name implicitly accept an additional challenge to show what it means to be a people made of many peoples with a transnational identity. Such a people may indeed be a tribe, but it is one that eschews tribalism. Likewise, it offers a universal vision, yet renounces imperialism. Triangulating, then, to be a Catholic peace church and not just random peace activists, just war and pacifist Christians alike must be clear about their primary loyalty and core identity. So back, I say, to basics. Though the Second Vatican Council concluded more than a half century ago, Catholics around the world continue in many ways to live out the Vatican II moment. Sometimes this is tragic as debates over the Council get weaponized in our culture wars. Yet in the case of actual war and peace, ongoing debate was exactly what the Council welcomed. In the long arc of church history, high-level pronouncements by popes and church councils usually serve to close debate, hopefully by summarizing the consensus of the faithful. But in this case, the Council did something quite rare. It invited, rather than concluded, debate. Surveying the savagery of modern war, it noted, all these factors force us to undertake a completely fresh reappraisal of war. As they sought to read the signs of the times in 1965, the danger of nuclear holocaust loomed especially large. But even without nuclear weaponry, modern war increasingly seemed to defy the warnings of the just war tradition. How to keep fighting proportionate to the good that its evils are supposed to protect? Can one really target carefully enough to protect non-combatants and civilians? Given the lethality of modern war, the Council issued its only outright declaration of anathema. Every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas of their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. While pleading with the world to unwind its arms race, therefore, it was also quite blunt in its condemnation of genocide and imperial domination. And lest injustice invite violent insurrections, the Council Fathers urged international cooperation on behalf of developing nations that were just now gaining independence out from under colonialist rule. Signs of the times are a moving target, however. A century after the Council, some human phenomena that were only barely coming into view now loom large. The Council spoke eloquently of what we now call globalization. Growing interdependence was their word, interdependence through new levels of economic, technological, and cultural exchange. But one sign of our 21st century times that was not yet obvious to the Council was the number of non-state actors both waging war and working for peace. Writing on war and peace, the Council Fathers generally assumed that the relevant unit for deliberation was the nation-state. Even when urging stronger international cooperation, their operative mental map was that of the Westphalian system of sovereign nation-states. But that map is now more complicated. Most famously, nation-states themselves are increasingly preoccupied with asymmetrical warfare conducted by non-state actors amidst an alleged clash of civilizations that transcends borders. More hopefully, with globalization now in full bloom, many other non-state actors are acting too. When we refer to the international community, we do not refer only to the United Nations or its institutions, nor to regional bodies such as NATO, the African Union, Organization of American States, and so on. We refer also to global corporations, which too often elude accountability, but sometimes do leverage their power to practice social responsibility. We refer to the myriad of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, doing humanitarian work and advocating for human rights. We alternately celebrate the potential of Facebook and worry about its vulnerability to manipulation. Meanwhile, migrant communities of all kinds are moving and mixing as they seek what the global economy offers, but do not necessarily want to lose their cultural identities, and so use new technologies to maintain diaspora networks that span continents. Make sure I'm in sync here. What Gaudium et Spes says in an earlier chapter on the proper development of culture has thus proven at least as relevant to our topic this weekend or these days as the pages that directly address war and peace. A series of prescient questions there ask things like this. What is to be done to prevent increased exchange between cultures, which ought to lead to genuine and fruitful dialogue between groups and nations, from disturbing the life of communities, overthrowing traditional wisdom, and endangering the character proper to each people? In other words, how to promote a universal culture of mutual regard without either homogenizing vulnerable cultures around the world, or, we might now add, inviting blowback from those who feel their identities threatened. The challenge of globalization that the bishops saw coming, even if they used different words, are as much at play in 20th century war and peace building as in the competitive jostling of sovereign nation states. To be sure, borders certainly have not disappeared, nor lost their power to regulate bodies and divide families. More than ever, borders are firing imaginations with rival desires to build that wall and to push back in resistance. Yet, if anything, this too is a sign. Compared to the time of the Second Vatican Council, it's less often clear that supposedly sovereign territories are the obvious relevant unit of analysis. People on all sides, in all cultures, in many lands, may invite this changed reality or react against it, but they cannot avoid it. For as Pope John Paul noted from the hopeful side of this tension, writing midway between the time of the Council and our own, The present generation has seen the obstacles and distances between individuals and nations dissolve or shrink through an increased sense of what is universal, through a clearer awareness of the unity of the human race, through the acceptance of mutual dependence in authentic solidarity, and through the desire and possibility of making contact with one's brothers and sisters beyond artificial geographic divisions and national or racial limits. Or as Pope Francis regularly insists in one of his 4 key principles to guide all work for peace and the common good, time is greater than space. Borders and territory do not finally define who we are. For Francis, this is an ontological claim, a statement about reality that is true for everyone. But if time is greater than space, then borders and territory should certainly not define the primary identity of Christians. Whatever its challenges or even its dangers then, globalization is for Christians also an opportunity to recognize who we really are, an opportunity to do ecclesiology well by embracing life in diaspora. For Christians to embrace life in diaspora means to recognize ourselves as a transnational people whose bonds of solidarity with one another and loyalty to Jesus Christ must ever form our primary identity and point our moral compasses toward the peace and justice of God's reign, our true north. In hard times, such an identity may require us to refuse to bow down to the idols of our day. But if such a people must sometimes be countercultural, they are no less pro-cultural. For often, life in diaspora will give us the same cultural and social creativity that allows resident aliens, exiles, immigrants, and other bicultural, multilingual people to contribute more, not less, to their host societies. In a way, everyone is living in diaspora now anyway. We are all intermixed among other cultures and peoples. This is true even for those whose cultural identity is privileged in such a way that they can pretend that they have no particular identity, maybe I should say we, or who have enough power to aspire to dominate a territory. They too are minorities on some map or another. If not that of a nation state, then the map of a regional or global market, or a watershed, or some other ecosystem. And if everyone is living in diaspora anyway, then a church with Catholic in its name, spanning many tribes and nations, might just find itself becoming Catholic again for the first time. Like T.S. Eliot's explorers who arrive where they started and know the place for the first time, Catholics as well as other Christians have a new opportunity to become what we were always supposed to be, and often, sometimes despite ourselves, have actually been. Already in the late 1950s, leading Catholic theologian Karl Rahner saw diaspora coming. Later, looking back on Vatican II, 25 years later, he argued that the Church's move into diaspora had been the fundamental meaning of the Council. Rahner was one of the most culturally engaged theologians of his time. But precisely because he engaged the world so broadly, he recognized earlier than most that by going global, Christianity was becoming a world church, open to all Gentiles, not just European ones, that it has claimed to be, a world church that it's claimed to be ever since it emerged from its strictly Jewish context in the first century. Even a Roman church could no longer pretend to express itself fully through any one culture, much less control a given social order. Rather, the present situation of Christians could be characterized as that of a diaspora, unquote. And that descriptive fact presented both obligations and openings. Rahner knew that the reality of life in diaspora would not find easy acceptance among some Christians. Nonetheless, quote, much depends on our fully and freely recognizing this fact and courageously accepting its consequences. Indeed, diaspora presented the church with great opportunity for evangelization, mission, and truly Christian work for the common good. Though only barely beginning to grope its way into a new era of Christianity, Rahner said, at Vatican II, the Church had for the first time officially recognized itself as a world church. And in a rudimentary way, his words, rudimentary, it had begun to act as such. Retrieving the ancient image of the Church as a pilgrim people at Vatican II was a key sign of this. Diaspora ecclesiology has unmistakable roots in the New Testament and was key to Christian self-understanding at least into the 5th century, even after the Church gained official status in the Roman Empire. The writer of 1 Peter addressed his readers as exiles in diaspora who once were no people but now were God's people. Indeed, despite their dispersion, they were, quote, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. A nation? We usually do equate nations with nation states. Yet even today, only a few of the nations of the world are sovereign nation states. Think of, well, in Minnesota, I think of the Lakota or Ojibwe. Think of the Maasai of East Africa, the Zulu of South Africa, the Maya of Central America, the Hmong of Southeast Asia. Anthropologists conservatively estimate that there are over 5,000 nations in the world in this sense. Less than 200 have membership in the United Nations. If most nations must forge and preserve their identities without sovereign control over territory, the Church can think of itself as a nation too. To be sure, a transnational, multi-ethnic nation, but one inevitably living in diaspora. This kind of a nation finds its security not by defending borders or building up militaries, but through peaceful hospitality and respectful guesthood as it lives among other peoples. Early Christians understood their citizenship in much this way. Having spread by tracking with the Jewish diaspora, they became a diaspora people themselves. One of the best windows we have into the life of an ordinary Roman Christian in the 2nd century, the shepherd of Hermas, reveals all the moral challenges of any resident alien who must navigate a hybrid identity that remains faithful to the customs of a homeland while respecting the laws of a host society. On trial in the 3rd century, the North African bishop Cyprian shrugged off threats of exile by insisting that as a Christian he was at home already in every land and already in exile even in his own land. Nor was this strictly a reflection of the minority status of Christians prior to the process of legalization that began with the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. At the climax of Augustine's long march through history and beyond in City of God, his final word about how citizens of the heavenly city should live within the earthly city, while still on pilgrimage, was to return to this very model. Writing 100 years into the Constantinian era, Augustine continued to insist that Christians should identify with the Hebrews in Babylonian exile, to whom the prophet Jeremiah once wrote, counseling them to seek the shalom, the peace, the welfare, the common good of the city in which they now found themselves, but to do so precisely as those who knew a higher loyalty. Diaspora usually implies a homeland, though not always, and a dream, however fleeting, of return. So what really is a Christian's true country or nation or homeland? When the Second Vatican Council retrieved the ancient image of the Church as a pilgrim people, it came with an answer. The Church will continue on its earthly pilgrimage toward the heavenly city until there be realized new heavens and a new earth in which justice dwells. So note, this was not simply an otherworldly answer. Yes, our homeland is in heaven, but it's also earth. The earth, too, is being renewed, and there are immediate, concrete, and practical implications already now. Recent popes have been grounding their moral instruction on behalf of immigrants, for example, in the prior theological conviction that all Christians in this pilgrim church are already effectively in diaspora, drawn from many cultures, mixed among many peoples, and called to live out the gospel in diversely enculturated ways, yet free from captivity to any one tribe or nationalistic claim. Francis was simply encapsulating what his predecessors have said about the particular challenge of migrants when he cited his role as pastor of a church without borders. Francis has certainly been quite aware of the mistrust and fear of the other, I'm quoting now, the foreigner, those who are different, end of quote, that has been prompting a backlash against refugees. He has expressed a sad realism that Catholics are hardly exempt from these forces, which are rationalized by a, quote, vague moral obligation to preserve an established religious and cultural identity, end of quote. His Christian response to identity politics, though, is not to suppress it, but to complicate it with a deeper identity, one we paradoxically strengthen by opening out to other identities. For as Francis continued from that same quote, the church has spread to all continents thanks to the migration of missionaries convinced of the universality of the saving message of Jesus Christ, meant for men and women of every culture. Dispersal, migration, and translation of the gospel into other cultures, seeking the shalom of their cities, lands, and families. To say this is to name a Christian diaspora. So why am I arguing that the key to becoming a Catholic peace church is ecclesiological clarity, not a resolution of the long pacifist just war debate? Well, the debates I've followed for decades between Christians concerning war and peace, foreign and military policy, have led me to a conclusion. It is the rare Christian who either decides to resist all war because arguments for Christian pacifism has convinced them, or decides to support or resist specific wars because they have carefully tested the latest call to arms against the grid of just war thinking. Now, this is tough for an ethics professor to admit. I have to think the arguments matter. Yet something else always seems to trump such deliberation. Yes, we know war is evil, most will readily admit. Yes, we know Jesus taught and lived out nonviolent love, but we have a just cause. Isn't that enough for a just war? No, actually, a war that, for whatever cause, ceases to be just when you use disproportionate force, or directly attack civilians, or degrade the humanity of even your worst enemies through torture or humiliation. Oh, well, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And whether people say so or not, they got to do what they got to do because they are German or Russian or Argentine or Hutu or American. Identity again. Identity indeed. Too often Christian arguments simply serve to put a religious patina over what we were going to do anyway, because we are first something other than Christians. To be sure, we all have hybrid, hyphenated identities. In practice, moral reasoning rarely means pure abstract reason. Rather, reason is a tool we use to sort through the conflicting claims of our overlapping communities. But to do this well, our most basic of decisions, our decision, you might say, comes as we ask, what is to be the primary loyalty by which we will assess our other claims, all other claims? Following a pattern that traces back to God's calling of Abraham, the deep grammar of Christianity keeps offering a different way to tell the story of who we are in the world. If we listen, Christians may even offer the world a way to navigate the vexing tension between particularity and universality that may sound abstract when you say it that way, but is anything but. and often turns to violence. Let me explain. War and violent conflict have many causes, of course, but in a globalizing world, one thread, one barbed wire perhaps, runs through all of them. We human beings find it very hard to defend our tribes without becoming tribalistic, by limiting our moral concern to our own kind, often by denying the full humanity of our enemies. But then when we try to counter the violence of narrow and obvious tribalism by making broad appeals to cosmopolitan values and by promoting a universal culture with international institutions to structure it, we end up creating empires. Augustine once wrote famously that a kingdom may hardly be different than a band of pirates except in scope. Likewise, just because an empire is big does not make it any less tribalistic. Empire thus invites backlashes of all kinds. I refer not just to the frank tribalism of ethnic warfare, but to liberation struggles in the name of self-determination. I refer to violent jihad, but also to the so-called populism that has surged in Europe and the US. But however distasteful may be the ideologies animating some of these movements, they are not devoid of some legitimate rationales. The white man's burden to bring civilization to the unfortunate brought colonial rule. But so too, and we're often blind to this, while promoting universal human rights, liberal democracy brings what political scientist Benjamin Barber has called McWorld, the banal, homogenized global culture of consumer capitalism. What feels like generous cosmopolitanism to its advocates ends up feeling like a steamroller destroying all that is dear to others. Now, my point is not to give up, that we should give up on universal values, but that the cosmopolitan project will bite back at us unless we simultaneously uphold the dignity and the value of particular identities. But how to do two apparently opposite things at once? It's hard enough to hold together a paradox in our minds, much less live it out. One of the little-known contributions of John Paul II was his sophisticated diagnosis on the world stage of the creative and necessary tension between particularity and universalism. Addressing the General Assembly of the UN on the occasion of its 50th anniversary in 1995, the pontiff unambiguously reaffirmed the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and noted that an unsuppressible quest for freedom had inspired, quote, the nonviolent revolutions of 1989 that toppled totalitarian regimes throughout Central Europe and dismantled the Soviet Empire. Christian concern embraces the good of all human beings, after all, as the Church endeavors to assist humanity in, quote, the common effort to build the civilization of love, founded on the universal values of peace, solidarity, justice, and liberty. A Christian universalism, no doubt. This universalistic project, however, must recognize, he argued, that communities and not simply individuals have rights. According to this communitarian vision, nations in turn have the right to, quote, a kind of fundamental spiritual sovereignty, distinct from political sovereignty. And note that the Pope, too, was distinguishing nations from nation-states. According to this fundamental spiritual sovereignty, every nation enjoys the right to its own language and culture. End of quote. So long as it does not abuse basic human rights or oppress other minorities, he insisted, quote, every nation, therefore, has also the right to shape its life according to its traditions. Particularity. The Pope did not claim to have an easy formula for holding together, quote, the tension between the particular and the universal, end of quote. What he did insist was that any adequate anthropology must hold the two poles of universality and particularity in a vital and inevitable tension, and that any social ethic or global politics must embrace this tension as a fruitful one if we are to live it out in, quote, a calm and balanced way. If we are to live in peace, in other words, and if globalization is not to mean homogenization. Exactly how the claims of individuals, nations, and nation-states are to be synchronized may be a difficult and require serious study, he continued. But what should be clear is from this anthropological foundation is that upon it rests, quote, the right of nations, which are nothing but human rights fostered at the specific level of community life, end of quote. The need to hold together universality and particularity has not become a standard item on lists of key principles in Catholic social teaching, but perhaps it could. Learning to navigate between them has not become a standard lesson in Catholic moral casuistry, but it should. Certainly John Paul II and his successors have been doing such navigation in practice. This is probably most visible when they speak to, again, the issue of migration, insisting as they do on generous hospitality and humane immigration policies. They consistently appeal to universal principles of human dignity and solidarity. But when they get down into the weeds about how to follow through on those principles, respect for particular cultures of migrants is often key. Pope Francis has his own version of John Paul II's insistence on holding universality and particularity in a creative tension. A second of the four principles that he regularly cites as key to peacemaking and work for the common good is that the whole is greater than the part. The whole is greater than the part, is how he says it. He elaborated on this in his encyclical on the joy of the gospel precisely by pointing to the, quote, innate tension between globalization and localization. End of quote. As the gospel seeks a universal order in which the common good of all peoples converge, it simultaneously embraces the genius of each people, his phrase. His vision of universal human equality, therefore, was not that of a geometric sphere in which all differences have been rounded off and erased, but that of a polyhedron. In his vision of a social polyhedron, it is cultural communities that become equidistant inasmuch as both pastoral and political activity enhance the distinctiveness of each part. Now, I expect that some of you are nervous about all this talk of identity. So am I. When I watch the news and see white nationalists marching with torches on the stately campus founded by Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville, Virginia, I too am tempted to see strong demands to preserve an identity as the very problem. But then I travel to the highlands of Guatemala for a research project among my Mayan Indian friends and celebrate their historic resistance to conquest and repression, while worrying that the forces of globalization might do them in at last. Indeed, the conundrum here often lies closer to home. I doubt if it's any different at Villanova. Catholic universities, like my own, are often laboratories for living out tensions between particularity and universality. Oops. I'm out of sync, but oh well. Can we preserve a vibrant Catholic identity while practicing hospitality and widening inclusivity toward others? How indeed to make an inevitable tension between particularity and universality a, quote, singularly fruitful one? The answer is to complicate, not suppress identity politics. Oops. What did I do? Anyway, the Enlightenment dream of a universal culture based on reason alone, freed from irrational loyalties to particular traditions, will backfire and invites backlash unless it does something richer and more complex. The Enlightenment project is itself a tradition, after all, and will only be blindsided if it only avoid being blindsided if it expects, invites, and celebrates particular contributions to peace and mutual respect as they are inspired and guided by particular traditions. Christians themselves will do this best by drilling down into what it means to be a pilgrim people that embraces life in diaspora. This is what sets Christians up to be peace builders and Catholics to be a truly Catholic peace church. To imagine and flesh this out is not mere idealism. Why? Number one, for a Christian believer at least, there's reason to believe that God's project all along has been to form a people blessed with that paradoxical Abrahamic identity, which they only preserve by putting it at risk as they seek to bless all the families of the earth. But number two, because it's effective. A final brief turn from theology to political science in order to show why. Despite the assumption that religion would recede in modernity, it is resurgent both in domestic and global politics. For many, this is a fearful thing, especially because the attacks of September 11, 2001 are what jolted them into noticing. One team of scholars, Toft, Philpott, and Shaw, had already noticed and launched a project to, quote, show not only that religion matters, but also to show how it matters. Why had some religiously inspired actors fought civil wars or engaged in terrorism, while others had promoted democratization and peace building? What they found after examining political processes in countries around the world and the role of actors from various religions was that two variables were key. The political theology or, quote, set of ideas that a religious community holds about political authority and justice was one variable. And second, the mutual independence of religious authority and political authority. Religion was most likely to inspire violence when used to justify the tight integration of religion and religious and political authorities, or to create some new integrationist order. In contrast, where religious actors were effective as key players, either in democratization or in transitions from war to just peace, they had both a clear political theology, envisioning participatory democracy or social reconciliation to guide them, and they had a sense of independence, resulting from deep roots in their own religious traditions. In other words, they had a clear sense of their own identity without being sectarian. For their very identity was one that required social and political engagement in a way that took them beyond captivity to narrow interests, either tribalistic or nationalistic. This, I argue, is what a diaspora ecclesiology gives us. In a globalizing world, as I suggested earlier, everyone lives in diaspora, dispersed among other peoples across borders, continents, and oceans. But the people who gave us the word diaspora, and for centuries constituted the classic diaspora, are the Jewish people, to whom Christians owe the greatest debt. One of their lesson books for living in diaspora is the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures. Whatever its legendary qualities, dreams, coded messages, fiery furnace, lion's den, those very stories were designed to teach new generations how they, too, were to live, were to seek the peace of the city as Jeremiah had insisted, while refusing to bow down to idolatry. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel were models of how to live, yes, as exiles, but also as civil servants who might sometimes rise into positions of influence without forgetting who they were. They had sought the shalom of the very civic order that had taken them captive, but was not to capture their ultimate loyalty. After all, to thoroughly assimilate and bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar instead of Yahweh their God would leave them little to offer that Babylon did not already have. Exilic service to the Babylonian common good would be all the wiser and more creative because they retained a distinct identity formed by loyalty to the God of Israel and faithfulness to the Torah. To become a Catholic peace church is to do just this, to prioritize our wider citizenship in solidarity with the global church, to follow a Lord who ascended to his throne by bearing a cross, not a sword, to refuse the idols of militarism, xenophobia, and mindless consumerism that tempt us today, and thus to serve the true common good of whatever society in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
Gerald, thank you. From this particular identity, appreciate your thoughts, and I hope these help further the ideas even more. Part of Gerald's talk reminded me of a trip that my wife and I took 5 years ago. We were living in Korea, so it was a relatively short commute to spend a 4-day weekend in Kyoto, Japan. We ended up spending Memorial Day exploring the ancient Buddhist temples, a majestic shogun castle, and a well-worn trail known as Philosopher's Walk, for those who are familiar with the city. It was only after several miles of walking that city that I realized I could only see these things because of a certain kind of restraint that was shown in the midst of a bloody, a brutal, and a very bitter world war. It was restraint that many here may think probably should have been exercised more thoroughly, and yet it still seemed to me fitting that my Memorial Day was spent commemorating not the more common topic of courage in the face of mortal danger, virtuous as that might be, but instead commemorating a kind of courageous judgment shown in the face of national danger, the honest evaluation of what was truly necessary versus what would count as gratuitous destruction, which was so tempting and so common in the pressure and carnage of that conflict. The respect for a culture is hard enough in peace. It's even more admirable in war. Gerald also notes that, quote, in a way, everyone is now living in diaspora anyway. We all live intermixed among other cultures and peoples, end quote. I think the claim is true, but I also think it's lost on so many, and as he referenced, perhaps especially us Americans, that they themselves fail to recognize the mix that they live in. They embrace instead an all too easy us versus them mentality that traces the nation state's borders and forms part of their identity. And in this insistence on an adversarial other, there's an overriding assumption of a zero-sum game. The other's gains must automatically count as our loss. This mode of thinking can cause us to miss legitimate and opportune moments of genuine solidarity, and therefore it can make us far too ready to resort to military action. This, to me, is what makes Gerald's picture of a pilgrim people such an important corrective. Seeing oneself as a traveler who is not fully at home in the nation state of one's citizenship enables a critical perspective on that nation state's actions. It undermines a thoroughgoing exceptionalism. Being a pilgrim shifts one's identity to something else, or at least something in addition to. The wisdom of Gerald's point, however, makes me return to this question. Are Christians the only pilgrim people? Can others also understand themselves in this way? Does a pilgrim people require a religious foundation? It definitely requires more than a reasoned foundation. I think Gerald is right to warn that arguments often sway us less than our identification. Even though he notes that, quote, the answer is to complicate and not suppress identity politics. The Enlightenment dream of a universal culture, as Gerald points out, based on reason alone, freed from irrational loyalties to particular traditions, will backfire and invite backlash unless it does something richer and more complex, end quote. I see Gerald's point as an important insight and a challenge that should steer us ethics instructors. Perhaps we shouldn't be so focused on only explaining arguments and their reasonableness, but also, even more so, we should be focused on assisting students in unveiling and crafting their particular identities. Specific to issues of conflict, we must resist the idea that particular identities can be wiped away to make for a just and lasting peace. And instead, the endeavor must be to craft sufficiently good identities, with the unavoidable particularity of our own circumstances as part of the mix. Regarding the just war tradition, I see three specific observations from Gerald's points that might be worth considering. First, no matter how strong or universal that justified cause, the pursuit of that cause requires an equally strong restraint regarding some means over others. This restraint, as Gerald suggests, cannot be achieved through reasoning alone, but requires support rooted in our identity. It reminds me of the work of another just war theorist named A.J. Coates and his critique of a strictly rule-based reflective morality, which Coates claims is a distinctive mark of contemporary just war thinking. Coates says, reflective morality puts its faith in the rule. It neglects the fundamental issue of will and motivation by assuming, wrongly, the self-motivating power of reason, end quote. What Coates calls will and motivation, I think corresponds very well with Gerald's point about identity. As a second brief point, the justification of the cause can all too easily itself become an idol, forming too much a part of a nation-state's identity, or of those soldiers perhaps serving that nation-state, or of the citizens themselves. And if we're not careful, allowing that into our identity will lead to excessive violence, dehumanization, and militarism. Gerald offers us an important reminder that our identity is something to tend like a garden, requiring vigilant upkeep. It's not a permanent, unchanging fixture of our lives. As a third point to consider, Gerald's comments make me wonder if peace is being given its due. Are just war theorists attending to that which justified wars are meant to serve? Are political leaders, are military practitioners giving peace this due attention? Are they helping or hurting the effort against, quote, militarism, xenophobia, and mindless consumerism, as Gerald listed them? Is the use of force, especially lethal force, being granted merely a sober amount of instrumental value? Or is it wrongly granted intrinsic value, valued as some kind of good in and of itself? These concerns about neglecting the peace toward which war ought to aim brings up vital questions about right intention. This seems to be a criterion of the just war tradition that's received less and less consideration. But Gerald's talk makes me think that it deserves far greater prominence. Right intention is somewhat amenable to good reasoning, but it also seems very important to notice how much right intention composes part of one's identity as well. So in each of these three ways, I appreciate Gerald's emphasis that our identity matters as much as our arguments. Specifically regarding Christians, they cannot hope to become identityless, but instead they can take hope in their identity as Christians, as pilgrims, as a transnational diaspora, to ground a different and perhaps better kind of cosmopolitanism. The question remains whether there's a substantial parallel for non-Christians as well. This person, personally, is thankful for the ideas. Thank you very much.
Sure, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Since Kevin has asked me a couple of questions, I feel I need to respond, although I may have a counter question for you. Please. So you ask, can others Well, in the end, you're saying, can everything I've said apply to non-Christians as well? Earlier you asked, can others be pilgrim peoples in the way I'm talking about? I was surprised. I mean, the quick answer is yes, of course. But I was a little surprised at the question because you're affirming what I said about everybody living in diaspora anyway, which is not quite the same as being a pilgrim people, but you're in that range. So what's at stake in the question for you?
Can I move this? I guess what strikes me as being at stake is what kind of solidarity can there be built with non-Christians?
Okay.
The wisdom you're speaking to Christians, I'm just curious if there's a way to access that wisdom among non-Christians too.
Okay. Yeah, it's, and of course you work in a different setting, for a secular organization, obviously, the United States government. Right. I work in a Catholic university and see myself as working for the church. Right. So obviously there's different accent here, but I mean, for me, the very idea. I mean, I was captivated by the notion of Abrahamic community, Abrahamic minorities, decades ago, from some things that Archbishop Domhelder Camara wrote about. Abrahamic minorities unite. I mean, he was a preacher, and it was high rhetoric in one sense. But he said, we don't have to invent Abrahamic minorities; they already exist in every community. The change agents are always going to be a subgroup within another larger whole, and the trick is to then have and here's where I started reflecting on all of this years ago. Is to then have a sense of a vocation that isn't over against the whole, but is for the whole. I mean, it would take another kind of scholar working on a vast stage of history to trace it, but my operating hypothesis is that because I'm a Christian believer, because I think God launched the Salvation History Project with Abraham, that social change project is what has given us the best of developing civilization, and it's worked the very model is one in which be a particular people, but in service to others, and then in that service, if another community wants to pick up on that same model, I mean, I think social movements have to be change agents in other ways. That's how it works. The only thing the one thing that kind of bemused me, and is part of why I asked my counter question, was that it is, in spite of a lot of postmodern philosophy that in the last generation or two critique of big universals, the idea that we can ever achieve that enlightenment goal of having just one rational culture. Old habits die hard. And so I found it intriguing that you jumped from, okay, will this apply on this other? Will this apply to other peoples? I mean, I get the reasons if in many ways, but I was wondering, is it that jump in which we can only get to trustworthy ethics if we run them through universals and then back to particular communities? And my argument is that my belief is that God has been getting to universals by working through particulars. Yeah.
So
have about 10 minutes for questions. You got the microphone. Thank you, Langdon. Just to ask you, please keep your questions to a one-part question since we only have about 10, 15 minutes.
I'll try to do that, and it's directed that I heard you, Paul Sheldon, Villanova University, retired Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. You're talking about reducing causes of conflict on this pilgrimage, getting, less empires, consumerism, tribalism, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're reducing the causes of things. But also you just put aside the notion you didn't want to deal with pacifism compared to just war. I don't think those are sort of such simple either-ors. And getting at that, I think something more positive has to be done, and I'm asking what you would recommend for the church to become a Catholic peace church other than just getting rid of the conditions. I may only say myself, it took me decades of struggle. There was no day I now identify as a pacifist, a religious pacifist. For decades, I was halfway there. So, and even still, it's precarious. So can we, I don't want to just dismiss the notion of, we can't wait for everyone to be pacifist. I will tell you, my experience, it's way too difficult. But I think there's a value to identify and work in that direction, and more so than just reduce causes of war. So how would you identify that the church positively go forward that way?
Well, I mean, the write-up for this conference mentioned, the call 3 years ago from a meeting in Rome, Pax Christi, and it's been folded into the new dicastery. The Justice and Peace Council of the Church sponsored an event that called for not using just war language anymore. I was at that meeting. You probably picked up. I've been Catholic for 15 years and was thinking about it for a number of years before. But my background is Mennonite. I still consider myself a Christian pacifist. I'm not sure my Mennonite friends all quite trust that, because I've proposed things like just policing and so on. It was a strange event for me because I ended up being one of the few people in the room at Rome in April 2016 who was wanting to defend the just war, at least be careful about our language, because I so appreciate the work of stringent just war practitioners who really want to take this tradition seriously, and as part of critiquing to limit war. And so I didn't, partly it's political, I didn't want to lose those allies. So I say that just to clarify, I'm in this space where I've so often seen the conversations we need, well, and it's been the experience in the last 3 years, so the contribution of that conference to start a dialogue about, as you say, moving in the direction, whatever we end up doing with just war as it's provided a vocabulary for engaging in international policy. I mean, even my Mennonite pacifist professors said, we got to use the just war language to engage. It's the lingua franca of the public square. And I don't see how we can, it's a contribution of the church that just war principles and so on have gotten embedded in international law. I don't find peace activists saying, well, let's just jettison the Geneva Conventions, because they want to appeal to that too when it comes time. So, but yes, in terms of your main question, I want to work for a consensus in which, in the Christian church, we recognize even to practice the just war, even to be faithful to the best insights of the just war tradition, you've got to be doing lots of things. First, you've got to be investing in active nonviolence, forming people, beginning in this Abrahamic model, beginning with ourselves in the Christian community, but welcoming others too, in how to practice Gandhian nonviolence, how to scale it up so we can start to imagine civilian-based defense, protection of peoples through nonviolent forms. We've got to do a whole lot of other things. We can do that without, I think, without resolving the pacifist just war impasse. Because really, to take the just war seriously, you've got to pay attention to everything short of last resort. And if you're not really seriously investing, as church certainly, but as societies, in alternative strategies, you're not meeting the criteria of last resort, in a general kind of way. So, yeah. Well,
Joe? You have a question, I can get you on the queue if anybody else wants to.
Sir, you said, if I'm not mistaken, that we should, that Catholics should allow, like, converts to keep their cultural identity. But is that true? I didn't misunderstand that.
Well, it's been, I mean, one of the tasks, certainly since the Second Vatican Council, articulated by Pope Paul VI 10 years later, has been to do mission work in a way that makes sure that the gospel is being enculturated. That's our theological word. The gospel puts on the clothes of, takes up the language of a given culture. It's not going to leave any culture unchanged. Shouldn't leave our culture unchanged, but that's the idea. You have to begin with a basic respect for other cultures and accept the challenge of presenting the gospel honestly. Pope Paul's language was propose, not impose.
Sir, do you not worry that, like, if you allow that sort of, it sounds like syncretism to me, but if you don't, if you like allow cultures to keep their identity, like, I'm sure we can imagine a culture that believes that, you know, a priest can be married or a priest can have like many wives, or just any man can have multiple wives. But I mean, and if the culture refuses to accept Catholicism because Catholicism is against that, but you want to convert them and you do, wouldn't that syncretism kind of go against the idea of making one Catholic identity? If they keep their cultural identity, aren't you pulling away from that one Catholic identity? It just seems to me like you can either be all Catholic, or I mean, if you're going to be splitting it, either like say Nzebi, a tribe in Gabon, Africa, who enslaved the Moini. If you cut your culture between Nzebi and Catholic, you're not going to be fully devoted to Catholic.
Working that tension out is part of the job of missionaries, good pastors, good priests. I'm going to seem like all I want to do is ask counter questions, but you know, do you use a Christmas tree?
Oh, yes, sir.
Well, that's a Druid practice. So, I mean, the point is, Western Christianity has already done lots of enculturation. It's part of what happens inevitably. It's part of the. I teach a course on global Christianity, and so I work at these kind of issues, and it's a tension that's in the DNA of Christianity from the very beginning. You know, look at the book of Acts, Acts 15. They're dealing with the question of, you know, do these new Christians have to become Jews on their way to becoming Christians? They're working at, you know, we want to preserve our heritage. That's why we still have the Hebrew Scriptures as the Christian Old Testament. But we're also going to make some changes. Doing that well is never easy, but it's unless you want to claim that the Catholic Christian culture is automatically Western, and aren't recognizing the ways in which Western Christianity is already enculturated in lots of ways. I don't know how you avoid it. So.
Okay, so right here, and then this gentleman over here is next.
Just a really simple, quick question. You talk about tension a lot, and as a fellow practicing Catholic.
This is why I have an affinity with Augustinianism. So,
Well, I just wonder, I mean, I loved your presentation, but it's rather abstracted, and living with tension is not particularly comfortable. So I'm wondering what your practical advice for practicing tension is as a theologian. Like, what's the application of that? How do we achieve a peace ecclesiology as an individual in the church?
Well, you're also asking me an abstract. So, I mean, you want to give me a case study?
Yeah. Yeah, go, you want to follow up then? Sure.
So I embodied the tension of different identities as a military chaplain, wearing the cross on my chest and the flag on my shoulder. And so a lot of what you've been talking about is identity. So speak to the people in this room who are wearing the uniform, who are being formed in the military identity as a soldier and an officer at West Point, but who also may be Catholic or Christian of another perspective, or maybe Muslim, I don't know, but maybe have that identity and are going to face a situation where those identities are in tension. My colleague, Michael Yandel, has framed moral injury as an identity crisis, and we've talked about moral injury in this conference. I've seen that. So speak to this reality of moral injury as an identity crisis and what many people in the military and our veterans experience in these conflicting loyalties. And what does it mean to be loyal to the church versus loyal to the state? And how do we live that out?
One of the things I cut out in the interest of time was a paragraph to make clear that everything I'm talking about here, I think, is at least as necessary for someone, living in the just war practice, not just tradition, as it is for Christian pacifists, for people committed to a nonviolent practice. Because I don't know how there's lots of reasons why I couldn't be a soldier, I just say that. But I can only imagine being a conscientious soldier and a conscientious Christian if one is prepared to sometimes resist orders if they're seen as unjust. I know that's part of the military code at a certain level, but I would have to lower the bar, I think, to make clear my first loyalty is to Jesus Christ. And so, but the point is, I mean, the whole just war tradition, if you're going to apply it as a Christian, requires, and not just since in the ways that it's gotten written into international law, gotten written into the military manuals and so on, requires a readiness to leave, resist at certain points, to anticipate where those points are. Now, I understand all the reasons why soldiers in our country, where we want civilian control of the military, aren't making independent decisions. So I know it's going to be hard, but I would say, Here's another counter question, I'm sorry, but, I would put it back. You show me how you can be, put your loyalty to Jesus Christ first, above the nation state, even while serving in the military, and that'll actually convince me that the just war tradition works. Now, I would add some other things, like if we're going to talk about it structurally, the bishops have advocated, every once in a while at least, for selective conscientious objection. There would be ways to structure some of this into society that recognizes people more clearly. People have overlapping, sometimes conflicting identities. But obviously in a room with people with uniforms on, I think we face it. We face it in other institutions too. So it's not just, I'm retiring earlier than I expected from my university because I can't stand the direction it's going. Now, I don't know if that's a conscientious decision or I'm just tired of these fights that we've, over the future of Catholic higher education. But just to say, all of us face these issues. So there would be other case studies.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we're out of time. Actually, just over time. But let's thank these gentlemen once more, please.